Okay, welcome everybody to week 4. I hope you all had a good, well, not terribly hot. Where if you guys are up here, I know it wasn't at 115 or 112 or 13 degrees. It was only a mere 98 or something in Berkeley. So hopefully you're in a cooler spot than you were on Labor Day. I think I said it right. But we have a couple of announcements. Let me admit, I'm just doing here. My first is that as of last week, because of all the background noise, I've decided, like most other teachers have told me they do on Zoom classes, is to mute everybody, but not permanently. You can unmute yourself. I set that parameter so you can at any time, and I encourage those kind of questions or logins and things, as you know, because that adds to the knowledge for all of us and clarification. So another thing, I think 2 weeks in a row now, I've been getting emails on the day of a Zoom class, a Wednesday anyway, which is, of course, today. You can see from the background, I'm not at home, I'm up here. I don't have any handouts on my laptop. They're on my, I don't know, desktop mainframe back in Berkeley, because I've already got this is loaded up with videos, of course, for each of the classes that I then post on YouTube. And so if you ask me that on the day of a class, I won't be able to get you that forward to you, a PDF of whatever handout. And I'm happy to do that when I'm up here in Santa Rosa. It's not possible. So you just have to wait till the following day. Just so you know, I think 2 people, well, one this week and one last week, had asked that. And I don't always follow up within 24 hours. But when I don't have access to those files, I can't do anything about that until tomorrow afternoon. If you had a need, one person asked for the list of terms to know, but we're only going to do one new definition, okay? And that way you don't have a lot of notes to take on terms. Okay, let's look ahead before we start today's lecture, which is on Baroque art for the next 2 weeks. Let's look ahead so everyone's clear about the upcoming deadlines. I noticed a couple of you, kudos to those who chose to have already asked me if a certain topic was acceptable. Again, if it isn't already clear, every single work of art from any period, any artist, any culture, any style, you can write about, as long as it's not your own art. Any work of art doesn't have to be part of the period week or topics that we cover in this class, okay? And then those papers, of course, looking ahead, are due on the 21st. By midnight, and I will give you detailed instructions and forward to you a PDF of the cover sheet that you'll need to attach. I know some people have trouble with this, and I won't, make an issue of it, but please, if it's physically possible, add the cover sheet to the same file so it's all sent at the same time. And I'll explain all this and send you an email, and I'll hold up it, hand-printed instructions. You'll see what I mean on the week before the papers are due, which is, of course, 2 weeks from today, your papers, if you want them on time. Okay, so you can question me, ask. 1 or 2 people have said they might send me a sample of what you're welcome to do that. Just don't wait till the day before it's due. Give me at least 48 hours before the due date to give you feedback online. We don't do that during the lectures, of course. And then the exam, the first midterm, and then we'll get to our first slide, is the following week. I know that's a quick turnaround time, but we have a lot to cover. This is world art. So with world art, we are covering 5 continents. Well, let's see. Yes, 5 continents. That's right. Over 500 years. And that's a lot to cover. And we don't want to rush through any of the topics. So after the first midterm, we get to the world art slides for the next several weeks. And then we have our second midterm later on in the semester. We don't have to go that far ahead, but I just want you to know the 2 upcoming deadlines are the 21st for your papers, and the 26th is the midterm, the first midterm. And we'll review for that first midterm on the 21st, and then you'll have 5 days to study for it. Okay, so let's get to our first slide. All right, it will be a Baroque art. Okay, and this isn't a must know, but I always like to give you, let's see, is there anybody who's still, let's see, participant, somebody else needs to be admitted. Yes, admit, oh, there we go. All right. So let's take a look at the first few slides are just for your information. So you'll have to take notes until I get to the first must know, and I always tell you when that's coming up. Okay, this is a palace that is in France, so 40 miles or so outside of Paris. It's now Versailles, the one everyone's heard of perhaps, but it's one of the more famous ones in France, Fontainebleau, which is a royal palace built in the late 1500s, and then in the 1600s during the Baroque period. That's what we're covering and why I'm showing it to you. It was remodeled into Baroque style instead of the early Renaissance, which is the original style. So what examples are there? You don't have to take notes on this now, just look and listen. This is the main staircase that was added in the 1600s. You have to know when it was 1640 or so. By that time, Baroque had taken over and we'll define the Baroque when we get to the first must-know slide in about 3 or 4 slides. But just watching here, you can see how the staircase has one of the features that marks something as a Baroque style, and that applies to all Baroque art, whether it's painting, sculpture, drawing, or architecture. Those are the main types of Baroque art. Okay, so what is this? This is the grand staircase or main staircase, the entryway leading up to the front door of a palace for one of the, well, all the kings of France, even Napoleon, actually, he liked this better than he did the Louvre, and that's why the Louvre became an art museum. You don't have to know this. It was a royal palace for the kings of France whenever they were in Paris, and he hated it. So he converted it to an art museum, which it's been over 200 years ever since. But he kept some of the other palaces, never mind, he called himself a leader of democratic reform. He was just as much a tyrant as the kings he replaced. He became the emperor, right? And he moved to this palace, and he didn't have to remodel it because it was already in this style. Look at the staircase. Those are bulbous. That's one of the 4 features. It's on your list. We'll go over these. You don't have to write this yet. 4 features that mark something as Baroque. You see where I'm showing it curves in and out. Fat, rounded, or curved and rounded shapes is what we mean when we say bulbous shapes of the details. Even these finials here are, the shape of the earth, right? The globe, and they are particularly, big Baroque in style. So let's now move on to another detail. Again, this is not yet the must know. This is one of my favorite examples of, I took these slides, these are my own slides, favorite examples of what Baroque is all about. You've got the bulbous shapes on both some of the human bodies, including the baby angels. Again, I need to write this. You see them, the cherubs, and then the women here. And then you have them on even this horse. Look at the horse's haunches, the hindquarters here. Rounded or bulbous, you could just say curved and rounded shapes. Bulbous is the right word to use, are a basic element of all Baroque art, and particularly in architecture. Of course, this is sculpture and painting, obviously, too. It's in the entry hall. This is what you see, the first room you walk into. It's open as a museum, of course, and that's no longer. There are no kings of France anymore. And so you'd see this the first thing, and the visitors in the 1600s would have known, oh, I see, this king is really, into Baroque style art. And you'll see even more of that as we go into the library. One of the most amazing rooms in all of, well, Europe at least, is the Royal Library at Fontainebleau. This is another room in that same palace. It's got like 50 rooms or something. And it's one of the largest private collections of library books in the world. It can still be used as a library, which you have to have special permission. So look at the ceiling. Let's go take it close, and then we'll get to our first must know. This is a painting on the ceiling of Mars, the ancient Greek and Roman god of war. No, he may not be bulbous on any part of his physique. Everything around him is. Look at these decorative details, especially along, the borders here. And then there's an encrustation. It's called, this is my own phrase, encrustation. It is on your list of 4 terms and with the 4 features, 4 features that mark something as Baroque style, which I will then give you before we get to the meaning of the first must know, which is the next slide. Okay, so the point is that there's excessive ornament, but I like to use the phrase an incrustation of ornamentation because that kind of gets across the idea that, let's see, is admit. Okay, there you go. Well, so we haven't got to the first must know, so you joined just in time. So you get the idea. This is an ornate room meant to emphasize the wealth, of course, and power. At that time, France was the most powerful country in the Western world. They had the biggest empire, but that's before the British Empire overtook them. This is in the 1600s. Okay, so now let us go to, whoops, don't want to do that. The next must know, which I'm going to, whoops, I overshot it. There we go. This is the first must know. So now you need to take notes. But let's go over the definition of Baroque. I actually wrote it out for you to make it easier because these are kinds of phrases you may never have seen or read or heard. So here we go. For this, you might be asked this on the midterm, on the first midterm, on a true, false, or fill-in type question. 4 main features of Baroque art. This is the definitions that's at the top of the second page of the list of terms to know for this week. Okay, bulbous, I already mentioned. Those are rounded shapes. But bulbous or rounded will do, but the preferred term with art historians is bulbous. You just saw examples, and we'll see more as we go today. The second feature on the list of 4 features that make a work of art Baroque is an unseen presence. I'll explain that on each slide that we see today. What does that mean? It depends on what work of art we're looking at as to who or what the unseen presence is, but all true Baroque art, whether it's architecture, painting, sculpture, has an unseen presence, something off the edge of the composition that is implied, but we'll see that as we go. Okay, that's the second feature. Or the third, oh yeah, there we go. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, so yeah, I meant to request that because I appreciate that students helping each other as always. All right, the third feature is what I mentioned with the library, the ceiling of the library. This is my own phrase, but I think it's easy to remember. In any case, it's the way to summarize in a few words what this feature is. An encrustation, that's one word, N with an E, encrustation of ornamentation. My way of saying excessive decorations or detail. That's typical of Baroque art of all kinds. Again, visual art that's in Baroque style. And then the last thing is a display of intense emotion. That is maybe even the most easily recognizable feature of Baroque painting and sculpture. It's not so obvious with Baroque architecture. Okay, those are all written out for you, so you didn't have to write those. So let's get to this, our first must know. And this is the colonnade of St. Peter's. And in case you forgot to put your the syllabus in front of the laptop while you're taking notes, it's C-O-L-O-N-N-A-D-E. One word, of course, means a row of columns, of course. Colonnade of St. Peter's with an apostrophe S. The architect is Bernini, B-E-R-N-I-N-I, 1657. And I know some of you have been to Italy, so if you want to speak up about this at any point, we're going to see more than one of Bernini's works of art. Bernini was considered the greatest Baroque sculptor and one of the greatest sculptors, right, of all time. I don't think anyone would argue with that, or at least of Western art. He's certainly the most famous and successful of all Baroque sculptors. He was commissioned by the Catholic Church to do all kinds of art, including a few architectural sites like fountains. And if you've been to Rome, you've probably seen some of his fountains. He did, at least a dozen, I think, or several anyway, in Rome. But that's what we're looking at now is his most famous, Bernini's most famous design, architectural design. And it's not the church. Remember, that pre-exists over 100 years earlier. And then Michelangelo added the dome. We already covered that in the last 2 weeks. It's not the church. If it's on the exam as a slide you have to analyze, I will give you a clue that don't write about the building, write about what's in front of it. This here, where I'm showing with the cursor, is the colonnade. It's really 2 colonnades, both of which attach to the corners of the church. You see that? If you've been to Rome, you almost certainly have been in this plaza. This is where the Pope, it's part of the meaning, the purpose of this, it's to enclose a plaza, a large public plaza, where up to 200,000 people can stand, standing room only, at one time. It can hold, you could just say, can hold up to 200,000 people, make it one of the largest public open spaces in the world. There are some bigger. In China and Russia, there's some bigger, but this is a pretty big one, 200,000 people. Why are they there? The second part of the purpose of this is to hear the Pope or to worship or pray on religious holidays like Easter and Christmas and other important religious holidays, because we're talking about Catholics right now. If it's not obvious, this is the mother church of the Catholic religion. That's the church behind the colonnade. So why did Bernini design this row of columns in this shape? Well, let's see if anyone, there's no right or wrong here. What does this maybe remind you of? If you look at this here, and let's say that the plaza was chock full of people, you know, I can't say the phrase, you know what, one part of your body to the next, and the people are packed in like sardines, right? So they are here waiting to hear the Pope speak. Okay, well then, can anybody think of something that this could symbolize? The shape I'm talking about, the way it curves outward. Obviously, this is bulbous. That by definition, the shape of these colonnades, at least the bottom or lower half of them. So what could that remind you of? Some gesture of a human body. Anybody? Sounds like somebody had a thought.
Open hands,
Say again?
like hands cupping.
I'm having trouble hearing you. I think you're saying some part of an action of a human being, or, you know, someone who is reaching. Okay, it's a poem. Here we go. But thank you for you. I couldn't quite hear the exact words or phrase you were using, but maybe you were saying, here's what it actually is meant to symbolize. The shape of this colonnade, okay, I'll say it slowly, it was meant to symbolize the arms of the mother church, there's the church, embracing the faithful. That's an actual phrase. I think Bernini used it, but you don't have to put quotes on it. But certainly that's how it was described when it was finished. Again, it was meant to symbolize the arms, right? That's these of the mother church. There's a church behind, embracing, right? Enfolding like human arms in a hug, right? Embracing the faithful, Catholic faithful. Just so you know, if it's not obvious, the world's largest religious denomination, listen carefully, is Catholicism. What does that mean? That's a subcategory within a larger religion. The second largest is Sunni Islam. They're both over 1 billion, but the last world survey, and there are plenty of non-biased surveys that the UN does them and other groups of world religions, shows about 1.33 billion Catholics in the world and about 1.1 billion or 1.2 billion Sunni, the main branch of Islam, and then Shia are about another 600 or 700 million. So it's the two religions are close, but Christianity is still several hundred million more people self-describe themselves. But within Christianity, the largest subgroup or denomination is Catholicism. So it is at this point in time still a holy site for people from all around the world. And supposedly, if you really want to make a pilgrimage here, it's part of your religious, beliefs. And for many Catholics, it is. I was raised part of my child was Catholic. I'm not practicing anymore. So I remember all this stuff from when I went to catechism with the nuns after school. Sorry, go ahead. Comments, questions, please.
Me too.
Yeah, there's a number of people who, so yeah, right. So you know how this could be.
I'm lapsed.
Yeah, it's a pilgrimage for people to make if they're very devout and they're continuing to practice or once did. But of course, nobody's asked what group they belong, what religion they belong to. People from all over the world and every religion and atheists, they're all welcome here. And it's open like this to the public 365 days a year, or 366 in a leap year. So let's talk about the details that mark it more as Baroque. You already see the fact that there are bulbous shapes to the overall outline of the columns. The colonnade is a row of columns. Another thing is the encrustation of ornamentation. Well, how does that fit in? Oh, absolutely. There are over 200 statues, one above each column. You see that here? Which are of Catholic saints. Declared saints by the Catholic Church, and those are ornamental and decorative and carved with all the details of their face and their clothing. So those are your encrustation of ornamentation element of what marks this as Baroque. But then some of you may ask, oh, but what's the unseen presence? Well, it would be God if you are there to worship. Right, in the higher power, right, that Christians call God. So God would be the unseen presence, again, if you're there to pray or worship. And then the fourth thing, the intense or display of intense emotion, is religious devotion. So the intense emotion is religious devotion. Write that however you want. And that quite literally, yeah, there we go. Hang on. Yeah, that quite literally is what this is all about. It's to inspire religious devotion. And that would be true, especially if you're there to see the Pope. Now, he doesn't appear every day. And so you'd have to know ahead of time what days of the year he appears. But it's more than a few. It's not only Christmas, Easter, it's several times each season and when he's not traveling.
Excuse
So
me.
yes, please go ahead. Mhm.
I was in there. I got lucky. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Please share.
I got lucky one day. I didn't know he was there, but I was there. And I'm telling you, you could hardly move. And I
Yeah.
was standing right smack in the middle.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And did he speak in he's the most popes?
Yes.
When was this the current one?
No, this is not the current one.
Oh,
No,
but
this is the
previous.
one prior.
Oh,
But
okay.
it's pretty exciting. It's pretty
Most
tough.
popes, what did he speak several languages? Most popes have.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yes.
English, French, German, Spanish, maybe
Yep,
even.
it was the Jubilee,
Yeah. Oh,
and I bought gold
yeah.
Jubilee coins.
Yeah. Oh, those are, yeah, collectible. Yeah, I was there in 2000. That's when I took the slides you're going to see of Rome when we, I'll show you some right after this. Okay, so let's finish up on the meaning of this. This was designed by Bernini as an addition. That's the right phrase. Not the church. He didn't design any part of the building, but an addition in front of or adjacent, you can say attached to the church. But now let's go back and see if it's on the exam. I'm going to tell you right now, this is the slide because you can see the whole thing. So some of you may not know this, but if you didn't, Bernini was a much better sculptor than he was an architect. In fact, he was a failure as an architect in this project. Wait, you might say, how can that be? It's still standing almost 400 years after he designed it. It took 25 years to build. So he designed it in the 1630s. This is almost 400 years old. Yes, the colonnades are, but he also, this is the last part of the meaning now, and originally designed it with two towers that would have been taller than the dome. That's a statement of ego on his part. He was a very talented artist, no question, but he's also very egotistical. And the proof, among others, other examples of that fact, is that the Catholic Church, ever since this failed tower, and I'll tell you how it failed in just a second, or a moment, is that now there's a law. I said this before when I showed you Michelangelo's design of the dome, that nobody can build a structure taller than the dome of St. Peter's because of this incident partly. What happened is that he was building these two towers and only one of them was getting close to, but not quite all the way to the top. It was nearly completed. But his assistant, we're going to talk about him, two of the next must-know slides are by his main assistant, who was actually trained as an architect. Bernini was never trained as an architect, and that's why this happened. He, the assistant, his name is Borromini. You don't have to write his name yet because we'll have two slides of his churches in a few more views. But just say one of his assistants, who is an actual trained architect, unlike Bernini, warned him, don't build those towers that tall. They'll collapse. Guess what? The one on this side, the left, collapsed and killed 25 workmen. It's amazing. It didn't kill more who were in the tower before it collapsed and couldn't get out in time. So that's why you don't see any towers at the corners of the church adjacent to the end of each colonnade, arms of the colonnade, because this one wasn't even halfway done. So they just pulled it down and never tried to build it. Another set of towers. Again, so that is an example of how sometimes, someone who's self-taught can be a genius. There are plenty of it. Frank Lloyd Wright was never trained as an architect. One of the most famous architects in history. We'll cover him at the end of the semester. So he turned out to be some, but then people complain and criticize him too for having roofs that leak. Yeah, we'll get to that later. But you got to say it's a pretty big failure when it killed people. And his own assistant warned him, don't do that. It will be a disaster. And it was. So that's why you don't see those towers. You can see the drawings of them in the Vatican Museum, I believe it is. So that's the last fact about the meaning. Formal analysis, well, it's a given that it's both stable and dynamic, but if it's not clear, of course, I'll explain. Obviously, the bulbous shape of the curved section of the arms are dynamic, and each column is stable. And then we have texture. Well, let's go to the other view. Yeah, there's similar texture on all the carved statues. I think it's about 200 of them. Yeah, they're above each column.
Mhm.
And yet the texture on the rest of it is all smooth marble. All of the texture is, other than the statue, is real smooth marble texture. Then you have the rhythm, of course, repeated shapes of the statues of standing adult. They're all men, by the way. And well, actually, maybe not. No, I misspoke. I'm sorry. Even this far back, there were some. There are more now female saints, according to the Catholic Church. So just say that the figures, the human figures standing, are of course the same basic overall shape and similar height. And each column that creates rhythm at the same height. Then for space, well, I could just tell you the columns are 60 feet tall. And I'll bet you'll remember walking through them when I show you my slide after this. We're finished with this must know. I'll show you, just for your own interest, a few views, close-ups of the columns from inside the colonnade and inside the church. So just say that the space is real space. There are two kinds of space. The columns are, the height of the columns is 60 feet, and the square can hold up to 200,000 people. So that's the real space. And then we have the colors are mostly cool on the marble, but there is warm tile. If you go back to the view here, you see that, the red clay tile. So some warm areas. The modeling is just the shadows from the sun, of course. The largest mass, well, they're equal. There's no larger, smaller mass. Both arms of these colonnades are the same length and height. So they're equal masses, and it's completely balanced, totally symmetrical. And the lines here are carved lines on the statues, or otherwise, I guess you could say on the edges of the roof line, there's visual line. Okay, and is there any, anything with, what's the word, abnormal or altered proportion? No, the human figures are all normal human size and proportions, as well as scale. These are actually, like roughly 6 feet or 5.5 to 6 feet, normal, full size adult human figures. Nothing is distorted. So there's no abnormal or altered proportion or scale anywhere on this piece. Okay, now you can rest for a little bit till we get the next must know. These are my own slides of the colonnade, and a couple of you have, right? Walk through these columns, they're overwhelming. Look at this, 60 feet tall. This guy, I talked to him, he was a soccer coach from Great Britain, taking his British soccer team to a match with an Italian team in Rome that summer. He was 6'7". I actually asked him how tall he was. I could tell he was taller than me. I'm 6 feet. Yeah, and do the math. If he's closer to 7 feet, and then look how much taller. It's an amazingly impressive scale of the columns. And it's all very, not very, of course, that's cool colors, white marble.
Very cool.
Yeah, and it's also cool physically. I think that's what you're, yeah, it's much, much nicer to walk underneath.
And it's raining, you duck under them.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if you're out in that plaza like you were. Oh my goodness. I've been there 4 times and only twice when the Pope was in town, but somehow I never made it on the days when he spoke, or I might have tried to be there. Okay, here's the interior. It's still not a must know. Isn't this impressive? This is the longest nave in the world. The nave is the main aisle of a Christian church, and we'll see more of those later, but it's not a must know, but do notice, look, it's 650 feet long, which is longer than 2 football fields, okay? And it's Baroque. Its interior was remodeled in the 1600s, around the time the colonnades were built, and it's more ornate incrustations of ornamentation, obviously bulbous or rounded shapes wherever you look. And this is the Pope's canopy, some people call it, about 40 feet high. Bernini designed this. So is it sculpture? Is it architecture? It's an overlap. He did that with his fountains. I mean, you could say a fountain is either just sculpture or just architecture. It's really both. And we'll see a Bernini fountain in a few more slides, but this isn't a must know. This is black marble with gold, actual gold, incrustation of ornamentation, obviously, symbolic of the family who became Pope. You're not supposed to have hereditary popes, right? It's totally against the rules, but they did for in the 1600s. There was, I think, 3 generations in a row of Barbarinis, I think they were, I can't remember. I think that's the last name of the popes when Bernini was their preferred architect and sculptor. And they commissioned him for a lot of very famous works, including this piece, which is where the Pope currently would sit when he's inside giving Christmas or Easter, right, services. And look at the angels. I mean, the unseen presence, of course, would be God. And again, the religious, but you have to write because it's not a must know. A devotion of a religious, fervor would be the intense emotion. Okay, now we're going to get to another Bernini, but before we do, these are two of his, he was only like 19, maybe 20 when he did these two. Damned Soul. Don't worry, it's not must know. The next must know is like 2 slides from now. Okay, this is this man recognizing that he just died and went to hell. Look at his expression. He knows something happened that he should have guessed back down on earth might lead to him being damned for eternity to hell. He's almost, you can hear him going, yeah, right. This has that bulbous look. I call it macaroni hair. That's, you don't have to write that. It's my term for Bernini's style of hair. He always had the hair projecting outward like this, kind of stylized, right, on all of his human figures. And then this is the opposite. Saved soul. You can almost hear her saying, oh, nice. She gets to go to heaven if she's not already there after she dies. These are two of his student studies while he was still in training. Pretty skilled for a person in their late teens. Huh? Okay, next must know. I should have said this with the first slide. I'm not cutting the colonnades of St. Peter's. That has a high possibility of being on the midterm. And so does this. When you get to an artist who's as influential and important as Michelangelo, Da Vinci, or now Bernini, I usually show at least 2, sometimes 3 slides of the same artist's work. And if that's the case, I rarely cut any of them from the study list. So don't forget that. This slide, take extra good notes, study it extra carefully. It won't be cut from the study list. All right, here's the title. One word, David. Bernini is the artist, Bernini, 1623. So what are we looking at? We're looking at a Baroque sculpture by the greatest Baroque sculptor. Everyone knows the difference between sculpture and sculptor, right? So that's again why it's one of the reasons it's so important. And the meaning is that it is a very famous and one of the most important sculptures by the greatest Baroque sculptor. Nobody argues with that fact. Why? Because it's an ultimate classic example. Besides the scene from the Bible we already covered with Michelangelo's David, of the battle between David and Goliath, which was a famous subject for sculptors for centuries. That by itself wouldn't make this so unique, but it's the quality of all of the features in the Baroque style that marks this is distinct, unique, one of the most famous sculptures ever. Here he is looking, I think it should be obvious, at an unseen presence. We probably could guess, but if it isn't obvious, don't forget to write. It's Goliath, of course. He's looking at Goliath. He's giving him a very intense stare or gaze because he's about to let go of the rock. So it's in mid-battle, very different than Michelangelo. Remember, Michelangelo's sculpture is before the battle of David and Goliath. This is in mid-battle. In mid-action, you could even say. He's literally just about to release the stone to kill Goliath. So the unseen presence is Goliath. The bulbous, well, I already said about the hair. I mean, look at that. That's so bulbous, it practically, that's why I call it macaroni hair. You can write out whatever word you want, but the hair is stylized. It's not, thin, stringy hair like most Europeans would have. So it's kind of a uniquely Bernini version of a Baroque style detail. The encrustation ornamentation, well, partly the hair, but mostly it's on the details, on the armor, on the slingshot, and even down here, right? You see it more. I don't know if you can tell, there's carved decorative feature, scales, almost like fish scales on the arm. He just chose not to wear the armor according to the Bible. I think he was supposed to be nude, actually, according to the Bible when he killed Goliath. In any case, there is an encrustation of ornamentation on the details of the armor, the slingshot, and his hair. And then we have the intense emotion, and that is determination. Obviously, it took great courage but mostly determination for him to focus. So you can say focus and or determination, an intense level of that in order to either do or die. I mean, he had one shot, literally one chance. He either killed his enemy or he was going to die, be killed by Goliath. So he couldn't do a second take. So it was literally an intense emotion, or intense concentration or focus on the battle, on his enemy. Okay, so I think you see how that covers all the basic features that mark it as Baroque. By the way, I don't know if you got to see this, Sonia. This is in the Borghese.
Yes.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah, Borghese. A lot of Americans don't get there unless they do their, if they took a class like this, maybe it's worth a whole afternoon, if not a whole day. It's a museum full
Mhm.
of great painting and sculpture, more sculpture, as I recall, than most museums, even in Italy, and a lot of Bernini sculptures there.
Well, when you've been going as long as I have.
Yeah, you've gone more times than one I know. Yeah. Well, and it's also one of the few places in Rome that has trees around it. At least it did the last
Mhm.
time I was there.
Mhm.
Yeah, it actually has a nice gardens, and Borghese Gardens are a
Mhm.
place where some native or tourists visiting Rome have picnics or take walks.
Didn't the Borghese family have something they built? Some of that stuff or
Yeah, they
funded
built the
some of it?
palace,
Yeah.
and I think it was their
Yeah.
estate grounds that now is owned by the
Yes.
government of Italy and open to the
Mhm.
public. Okay, formal analysis, it's balance. It's an intact human figure, of course. The rhythm is the two arms, the two legs, 2 feet. I sort of say two heads. No, two eyes, two ears. Plenty of rhythm, as all human figures would have. And then it's a cool white color. Or you could say neutral because there's no warm color next to it. But in the wall of the room around it, it contrasts. So you would say it either way. White, remember, can be either neutral if there's nothing else around it except gray and black colors. But if it's in a room or up against a wall, whatever, in the background, there's warm colors, I would call it cool. You see what I mean? The contrast of the cool with the background of reddish.
Would it
Yeah. Yes, go ahead, please. Mhm.
would it be unbalanced towards the bottom because of the presence of the armor?
A good point. I absolutely would accept that. And I think of it as roughly balanced because he's so muscular, his upper body. But I can see why it might appear that way. So I wouldn't dispute that. I'd say, yes, you could say that if it's on the midterm. Yeah.
Okay.
I think of it as roughly balanced, but you can definitely say the armor, it is slightly wider if you look at it. Yeah. It is, isn't it? All the pieces of whatever it is, his clothing he didn't wear or didn't want to wear, is slightly wider than the shoulder. So yeah, you can make the case it's somewhat or slightly unbalanced toward the bottom if you see it that way. And then we have line. It's all carved line to create the simulated texture on his hair and his clothing and his armor. The modeling is just the lighting from the museum. It is a several masses. So you'd start with him, then his armor, and then I guess the slingshot, because it includes, you see the rock is already in there. If you count it that way, as the three largest masses. There is no distortion or altered proportions here. His body is normal human, proportion, and the scale, well, of course, it's just a single human figure, is not altered. So there's neither of those features are present. Let's see, balanced rhythm. Oh, stable or dynamic? It's both. He's standing almost upright, but maybe because of his leaning over and his legs being, at an angle or diagonal, it's more dynamic than stable. Most Baroque art is. Okay, now we get to my favorite artists of today's lecture, and I'll explain why. You can just rest for a moment. Well, let me give you the title of the next lesson. And the view you'll see of it will be 1 or 2 slides from now. These are my own slides that I took in Rome, except for the must know actual slide, which I'll, of course, identify when we get to it. But now you can write the title of the next or third slide for today's lecture. Church of Sant, which is, of course, be for Saint Agnes. And that's, a female, of course, saint, obviously, Catholic saint. A-G-N-E-S-E. The architect's name was Borromini. That's B-O-R-R-O-M-I-N-I. Borromini. One word, Borromini. 1657. Now, I understand why for some people it might get confusing to remember the difference of the spelling, and the two types of people. Borromini and Bernini's name are similar, I know. They're both Italian Baroque era architects, but really there's a huge difference between them, and I'll explain that. Borromini, as I mentioned, was actually a trained architect. He was from Switzerland. This is part of the meaning now. So let's go to this is a view of that church, Saint Agnes, from a different angle with Bernini's fountain in front of it. I'll explain. There's a rumor, but I think it's a myth about why Bernini placed a fountain in front of this church. But let's get to that in a few minutes. Let's say first, as part of the meeting, you should be taking the notes now, is who was Borromini? How was he different than Bernini? First of all, he was trained as an architect. Second, he was from Switzerland, not Italy. He walked, look at a map, that's a long walk. Well, you probably got to ride on a few carts, horses and things, but he got himself all the way from Switzerland to Rome, and he worked for Bernini for a few years. He's the one that warned Bernini not to build those towers. And he was clearly right. He was trained as an architect and an engineer, much more professionally qualified to build any large public structure. So he designed churches all over Rome. And after that tower collapsed, Bernini fired him. Well, that was probably a mistake, but I would just say out of what, embarrassment, professional rivalry, really. So Borromini went ahead without any bitterness and just started his own career, and he got commissions like this. This is the view you'll see if it's on the midterm. I'm not saying it's so important, I absolutely won't cut it, but we'll see when we do the review. So for now, assume it may be on the midterm. Well, if you've traveled, as I have, all over Latin America, well, at least Central America, Cuba, Guatemala, Mexico, and you've seen old Baroque era, meaning 16 to 1700s, that's a Baroque period, 16 and 1700s, cathedrals or churches all over Spanish-speaking, part of the world, you will see this style of architecture. It's an invention of Borromini. So now I'm going to explain what that is. This is the next part of the meaning for this slide. Borromini invented a new type, you could say version if you prefer, of Baroque church architecture. And the three main features that he developed, this is on his own, out of his own genius, he was a genius, are these three things. You see them all here if you follow this cursor. An undulating facade. That means the structure, the exterior, of course, facade means exterior of these buildings, his churches at least, not all his buildings, would go like this. Out, in, and out. The whole building has a very fluid feeling. It's not an accident or just a side effect. It's a conscious design element. He made his facades undulate or move both in and back out and back in across from left to right, of course. So that's one of his original features. Another is flanking bell towers. You may think, oh, didn't everybody do that? No, not before he came up with it. Flanking bell towers, and these actually function. The church has been a functioning building for almost 4 centuries. And then finally, a central bell tower, right, with a very elongated cupola, which you could say is part of the second feature because it's with flanking bell tower. So the central dome, did I say bell tower? Central dome, I hope I said that, is flanked by the 2 bell towers. So all those things put together, the undulating facade, right? The flanking bell towers at either corner and the central dome with a tall cupola combined together to make a whole really popular, a very influential set of features. You'll see them on churches in Mexico. In fact, Havana, Cuba, I mean, it's one of my favorite cities. In Havana, Cuba, the main cathedral looks very much like a version of this 100 years later, designed by a Spanish architect who had been to Rome, who was influenced by Borromini. So this church got Borromini a whole bunch of recognitions, part of the meaning. After he designed this, he got commissions all over Rome. And guess who got jealous? Bernini. So here we're going to go ahead before we do that's enough on the meaning of this, but I'll go back and do the formal elements. But let's just finish the background stuff. These are my own slides here. And you see that I think you said the Jubilee year, you're about 2000, according to, many historians, if we don't know the exact year Jesus was born, but assuming it was when the Catholic Church says he was, that would be the 2000th anniversary of the birth of Jesus. That's the year I was there. I took these slides in 2000 and they were just cleaning this building. I'll bet you saw all over Rome, cleaning up the churches. They look quite nice. They haven't finished, obviously, with this one. So what's in front of it is a fountain by Bernini. So you could actually, one last fact about the meaning, Bernini designed a fountain in front of this church, and some historians think, but it's been almost disproven. You can just say a story told or believed to have been by many historians, is that Bernini decided to make this fountain a diss, or, you know, kind of a knock, however you want to write that phrase, against the church designed by his former employee and now rival Bernini, Borromini. Bernini's figures here look like they're all recoiling in horror. What? They're right in front of a church designed by a rival. So it makes some sense that it could be that Bernini was showing his disrespect and his, let's say, anger, even, resentment is a better word, resentment, at his former, pupil, former student or assistant is the right word, former assistant, Borromini, getting all these commissions. He passed up the chance, by the way, though that's not a minor detail. He passed up, that is, Bernini was given the opportunity to design this church first, and he laughed in the face of the Pope's, representative. They came to him and said, "Would you design this church? We're going to name it, and we have the money and all that." And he said, "You can't build a decent church, a very impressive building, in that. Look how narrow the space is for a major church like a cathedral. That is a pretty small space. These buildings are much older than the church. They're medieval or very, very early Renaissance." So he had a chance and he passed it up. And Borromini said, "I'll do it," and showed up his phone. Yeah, so you could see why he was resentful. And guess what? After that, they became enemies. Not Borromini. He didn't have that kind of vengeful attitude, but Bernini did something horrible. And I'll explain that when we get to the next must know, to ruin the career of his rival and former assistant. But when this church was finished, it just showed how talented Borromini was. Okay, let's do a formal analysis and then we'll move on to the next must know. It's completely balanced. Yay, here you are, welcome. We're just on the third slide for the list for today, Church of Saint Agnes. So here's the formal elements. It's completely balanced. Almost all Baroque architecture is, with the two flanking bell towers and the equal portions of the facade and the central dome. And then we have the largest mass. Well, that is the dome, including the drum. This is the drum and that's the dome. When you put it together, including the cupola, that's clearly the largest single section or mass. And then the two bell towers, and then the central facade or midsection. Then we have the rhythm, of course, with the columns, the arches, right? The sculpture, you can only see a little bit of it, but actually if you get up close, and it's got that incrustation of ornamentation. Obviously, the facade is bulbous. I didn't say that because it'd be obvious. Even the dome has this undulating effect out in again, as you walk, or sorry, as your eye goes across the left to right, of course, or right to left, actually, it doesn't matter which way you look, you'll see the undulating effect of his facade is obviously very dynamic. The modeling, again, with most buildings is not any technique of modeling, it's just the shadows created by the sun. The line is carved line and visual line, like most architecture, especially Baroque. The edges of the columns and the corners of the building are visual line, and of course, carved line is on all the sculpture. The texture is mostly the real smooth texture of stone and metal. This is metal on the dome with some glass. So they're all smooth, real textures, but there are some added textures on the sculpture here. Yeah, like these statues, some similar textures done with carved line, of course. And then we have for space, it's a large open domed church with about a 90-foot tall dome or interior. Now, I'm going to show you the inside in a moment. I think you'll be impressed, and I'll tell you a story about what to do, and some of you may know this, or not to do when you're in a foreign country and you want to see something that's not open to the public. I'll get to that in a minute. So to wrap it up on the formal elements, the color, this is a little misleading. Obviously, we saw in my first slide that it's an actual, totally, of course, neutral white color. You can call it cool because it's next to two warm colored buildings. These are apartments, by the way. I bet they're very expensive. This is on one of the most famous plazas in the world, Piazza Navona, where so many tourists end up spending days, and every movie ever filmed in Rome, there's, especially rom-coms set in Rome, people meet in the square, but they do. It's been that way for centuries. So this is facing one of the most popular public squares in the world, really, certainly in all of Italy. Anyway, so let's see, am I forgetting anything? Line, balance. Oh yeah, there's no differences in proportion here because we're not looking at human or living creature figures close by each other. So there's no abnormal or altered proportion or scale. Okay, I think I'm, yeah, so now you can rest and I'm going to show you this. When I went here, yes, go ahead. You have a question?
When I was little, they used to have art classes upstairs beside this building. And
that's very
I used to draw. That's how my father found out I could draw. Because I was drawing those buildings.
Inspiring, huh? Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I don't have that skill. I sketched them once or twice when I was very young, and it was so bad I threw the sketches away. Let's talk about briefly. You don't have to write this, but then we're going to get to another must know by Borromini and a very sad, tragic ending to his career. But before we get to that, the fourth must know, the next one, just listen for a minute. I was in Rome for like a week. I was a guest of a tourism agency, and I was lucky, you know, because I couldn't have afforded some of the things that I was allowed to see. Oh, my internet connection's unstable.
Can you repeat that? You froze.
Yeah, I know. How good. You can hear me now. I'm just saying, when I was in Rome the last time, I was a guest of an Italian tourism company, and they got me into a lot of places, but they couldn't get me into this church because it was under renovation. You see, they were restoring it. They were, well, first cleaning it and getting it ready for a big celebration. I was there before the summer tourism season. So how was I going to get to see the inside? Well, I walked up to the front door, and I was with about 20 other foreign tourists, and I don't read Italian, but I studied it in a phrase book, and I could see a sign that said no admittance under renovation. And I just thought, it's my last day in Rome. I wanted to see this church. I'd already been teaching here for a few years. So I knocked the big brass knockers on that door, banged them along with some other tourists, and the head of the crew came out. And in Italian, I think he cursed us. He said, "Go away! Can't you read the sign? We're not open." So all the other foreign visitors, you know, from Japan and Germany and India, wherever they were from, there were a big group of them, melted back into the crowd. I waited about 5 minutes till I could see they were all gone far enough away that they wouldn't see what I was going to do. And I climbed back up. There's some stairs here, and I was by myself. I banged on that door a second time, and this time when the guy came out, he was livid. I think he saw that I was one of the people who had just asked, and he told us no admittance. He said, "Can't you?" And they spoke some English. He said, "Can't you?" And I said, "Scusi," in Italian, my best poor Italian. "Scusi, signore, il sono il professor di architettura de Berkeley, California." Suddenly he said, "California, Disneyland, the Golden Gate Bridge. I love California. Come in." So that was the open sesame, if you know the Islamic story about it, Aladdin. And this is what rewarded me inside.
Ooh.
Isn't it incredible? Yeah, the light coming through that time of day was perfect. So he gave me 15 minutes to take any pictures, just don't touch anything. And I thanked him profusely and shook his hand when I left. It was just, the magic words were California. So if you're traveling in Italy and you learn some Italian and ask politely for permission for something where you're not going to harm anything, and they'll know that you're not going to. I didn't have any kind of a hammer or chisel weapons or anything. You could see it was just me and my camera. He was very happy to let me in, and then, you know, I got to see something I'll never forget. It was
pushy American.
Yeah, but being polite enough to speak in their own language, I think that's what made the difference. Yeah. Okay, so now the next must know is also Borromini, and it's the Church of San Carlo, and that's two words, S-A-N. Of course, it's short for Saint. The name of the saint was Carlo, C-A-R-L-O. I've already spelled Borromini's name, right, with two R's. Right, Borromini, same guy we just were talking about, 10 years later, 1667. This is what finally led to the end, sadly, of Borromini's career, because of the resentment and anger that is Borromini's design for this church caused in the mind of Bernini, who was a very vengeful man. He basically, Bernini, again, he was given a choice to design a church on the narrowest lot in Rome. It's only 25 feet wide. I mean, you can't even design a house on some of the lots that small, right? In most parts of the world. So even for Rome, as crowded as it is, that was the smallest lot of any church that had been designed, if ever, at least in centuries. And so guess what? Bernini passes it up. Borromini steps up to the plate and says, I'll do it. And he designed a masterpiece. So here are the facts. This church was designed for the Franciscans. Yes, the city of San Francisco was named after them. They were a wealthy order, you can just say group or subgroup of Catholic priests. They hired, after asking Bernini first, who turned it down, Borromini, because he'd done so many churches by this time, and he built a masterpiece. And why do I say that? Just because I like it? No. This building is studied by famous architects all over the world. I.M. Pei from China, who then became American citizen, one of the most famous architects ever in American history, one of my favorites, designed the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the National Gallery in DC. He studied this church. So did Frank Gehry. You've heard of him, some of you, right? Yeah, not my favorite architect, but he's world famous. And then almost every other famous architect you've ever heard of the 20th century has studied this building as part of their education. It's that influential because it has all the elements I mentioned of Baroque architecture, which the one thing you can't see is the other bell tower, which is there, but it's at an angle in this photo. I didn't take this photo. It's hard to get a photo of because it's such a tight, narrow little intersection or corner. And then you have the central, right, dome, and you'll see it from the inside. Plus the undulating facade, you can see this, obviously, which is part of his invention, the design. And it's so Baroque, it's an incrustation of ornament. Now you'll see my own slides, but only of details. This is part of the facade where you see angels and, of course, previous saints of the Catholic Church, and Latin, of course, for mentioning the group that had it built. And they were very happy with his design. And maybe the most amazing thing, now you should be writing this, besides that the people that commissioned him, you don't have to say which group, but it was Franciscan priests, where you can just say Catholic priest. And they were very insistent that whoever designed it for them have a dome. Well, in a space that narrow, it just, most people say, you can't even, Borromini wasn't sure he could do it, but guess what? He created a masterpiece. This is the narrowest dome of any church I've ever heard of. You say one of the narrowest domes, and not the narrowest dome of any church anywhere in the world. It's squeezed into a small space, but it doesn't feel like that. People, when they walk inside, including me and all the tourists, I heard them giving lectures in English to the tourist groups. It's that famous. Every day there are groups of tourists go through it. I think it's 50 or 60 feet high. It's barely 35 feet, the dome from the floor to the top. And yes, that's a symbol that's on the US dollar, the pyramid with the all-seeing eye that's on the US dollar. That's no accident, but I won't go into that now. That's a whole nother explanation. If someone was to write a paper about this church, he'd want to investigate that, what that means. But all you have to say is that he designed a surprisingly tall appearing, or what appears to be an unusually tall, narrow dome in a space that no one else could have done that but him. And it looks almost twice as high, the dome, as it really is. It's an optical illusion that he mastered. And then you can see he worked in the cross, the symbol of the cross, rising up toward, it's supposed to be symbolic of, rising toward heaven, right, as you look up. So what happened? Here's the last part of the meaning on this slide. It's on the exam. There's only one view. It's in black and white that was in the slide library. I couldn't get a full view of it. What happened is, you can guess, Bernie went bonkers. So he went nuts. How do you want to write that? He decided to blacklist or blackball. You could use either word. Some of you know what that means. Borromini. From that point on, he told the Pope, who's the head of the whole church that commissions all these things, don't you ever hire him again. If you do, I'll never do another design for you. And that's what happened. His career took a nosedive, Borromini's, because he didn't even know, behind his back, literally, in secret, his former employee and rival, Bernini, was so vengeful, so jealous, that he ruined Borromini's career by forcing the Catholic Church to choose between them. And of course, they had been working with Bernini, he was much older, a long time. So they chose to only give him commissions. So guess what? Borromini lost his studio, his home. He moved into a garret, up in an attic, and he was shunned and not invited to public gatherings, couldn't get new clients. And he eventually was found hung by the neck. He committed suicide from one of the beams of his apartment a few years later. And I think of it as a direct connection. People say, oh, he was suicidal, that means he was mental. Maybe, maybe not. But if you get treated that way, and your life's work is now suddenly shut off, well, I'd say that Bernini had responsibility to me at most. So you decide. Anyway, it's like a Greek tragedy, right? Where the gods and the humans are rival with who do they like best? Well, it's true that Bernini won out. He got rid of his rival, but I think of it as a very sad comment on what a small, vengeful person Bernini was, even if he was a great artist. Well, great sculptor. Okay, end of story. A ballad of what I've already covered these things, but it's the same as the last one. It's full of the curved lines of a bulbous Baroque church. So it's all almost entirely, or mostly, let's say, dynamic. Just the columns, really. This is the only stable thing in it. The largest mass would be the dome, even though you can only see the cupola from here. The rhythm is obvious. The columns, the sculpture, I just showed you a close-up of the statues here. And those have carved line to create some textures on their face and their clothing. The color is actually the warm color of pink stone. Did you get to see this church? Because I know it's not as famous.
Yes.
Oh, you did. So you really, yeah, well, isn't it neat?
I love the columns.
Yeah, I like everything about it.
Aren't they Corinthian?
Actually, yes.
Italic?
You're right, they are.
One of the two.
You guys don't need to know that for the exam, but yes, they're very ornate Roman, kind of a Roman style. I mean, as an ancient Roman temples. And then there is the texture simulated, of course, with carved line created on the sculptures, and real smooth texture of stone and glass on the building itself. The shadows, of course, it looked like an overcast day, but there's always shadows, of course, in these niches from the sun. There's no technique for modeling. The largest mass, I always said, is the dome. Oh, it's only 35 feet high, or maybe 40, somewhere between 35 and 40 feet, but it appears much taller, like 60 or more feet in height when you're inside, for most people at least. And so that's a real space of a large open domed room of about a 35 to 40 foot high ceiling. And then let's see, balance. Yes, it is. If you would stand right in front of it with the two bell towers in the central dome and the columns arranged evenly. So it is balanced. Okay, now we're going to go to, let's see, the next must know is really important. It's one that I won't cut from the study list. But before we get to that, you can rest your pens again. This is, and I know you saw this one, anybody's been to Rome has been here, the Trevi Fountain, which is a myth or story, I don't know, it may be true, that if you throw a coin in the fountain, you'll return to Rome. Yeah, well, everyone I know who's been to Rome who can manage to come back does, because it's such an incredible city. So this is a Baroque fountain and I love it. But when I was there, a National Geographic photographer was taking pictures of the fountain and he told me the story. The fountain itself, here it is clean now, but within a few weeks before he was there to start photographing, and he couldn't do this assignment because it was floating with wrappers from the nearby McDonald's outlet that had been opened within sight of the fountain. Now, you got to say the government of the city of Rome approved that and left it, and it wasn't just tourists by any means. Quite a few young people from all over the world, including local Italian citizens, were not taking, their responsibilities not to litter seriously. And then at some point, the city passed an ordinance that they would start fining the restaurant or something like that, or you're holding them responsible. So, and also a public awareness campaign. So the trash and stuff was almost all gone when I was there. But my favorite story about this is, and you don't have to write any of this because it's not a must know, is that there were hundreds of thousands of coins in the fountain by the end, because most people every week go to Rome, right? At least during tourist season. And so what happened to those coins? Well, the fountain was technically turned off from just like 4, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning till 6 for not very long. So there was a homeless guy that lived under an overpass somewhere nearby. And the government of Rome, and with the suggestion of citizens of that area who knew this homeless guy, he was not only harmless, he was perfectly sane and, able to, but he knows, through bad luck that happens to lots of people, just had lost his home, his apartment. So they offered to let him keep 10% of the proceeds if he would go along with some of the other homeless that he knew who were, reliable. And when the fountain was turned off, because it's not so deep, you can't wade in it. There are movies that show actors wading in the fountain. It's famous. A lot of movies have shown scenes
The
like
Dolce
that.
Vita.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Well, so it worked because they got the fountain cleaned and the coins picked up, because they just let them pile up. Eventually, that would cause a problem. And then they would take them down to the city hall or wherever it was, the police station, and the coins would be counted, and 10% of the proceeds would go to this homeless guy and his fellow homeless people, and they got themselves a place to live. Nice solution. There we go. Creative solution. Okay, here we go. The next must know. Maids of honor. Maids, plural, of honor, of course, like the word honor. The artist's name is Velasquez. Velasquez. Again, Velasquez. 1656. This is one of the most famous paintings in the history of art. It inspired artists for centuries, including the Impressionists and, of all people, Picasso. He did several versions of this in Cubist style. And we're going to talk about Picasso, of course, when we get to 20th century painting. Why? Why is it so influential? Because it creates several optical illusions that I'm going to now tell you. And no other painter had thought to put them all in, or even any of these, into a single painting. So we'll start with the fact that this is a scene in the royal palace where the little baby princess, right, Infanta, we can say princess, is being dressed by her maids of honor. And she's getting ready for a big dinner or a ball that her family's holding, her father and mother, of course, a king and queen. If that's all there was to it, the painting would probably have been forgotten, except outside of Spain. But it's world famous because of these features. Let's start with what optical illusions. Let's start with the mirror. Okay, we're standing directly in front of the princess and her maids, looking at her. There's no one between us and her. But look, something's wrong. Look in the mirror. There's her mother and father looking at her, and yet we should be in the mirror in front of them. Optical illusion number 1. He's playing games with this technique of placing us in the room and in the composition, and yet not at the same time. Okay, because if we were standing there like the painting implies, we would be seen in the mirror. We're not, just the king and queen. That's the first optical illusion. Now, this isn't an illusion, but it's an unusual feature. That's him, a self-portrait of Velasquez. He was the court painter, I should have said that at the beginning, one of the most important painters in Europe at the time. The king of Spain hired him to live in the palace and do all these paintings of his family. So he was court towards painter. And there he is as a self-portrait, painting the painting we're looking at. So there's another illusion, a painting within a painting, or a perspective on a perspective, if you want to write it that way. Then we have the most intense optical illusions, and there's several of them, of the multiple sources of light, which is physically impossible on planet Earth because we have only one sun. If we had multiple suns, this would be possible. The sunlight is directly, it's daytime, of course, seen, coming in from the far left, hitting the sides of all these people's faces. It's coming from behind, where the butler, or they have a different term for him, but the head butler is looking in to make sure that the preparations for the dinner are going well. So you could just say this guy, this staff person, but butler's a good word. Butler's standing there and the light's coming from behind, hitting the stairs and the doors. That's at a 90-degree angle from where the light's coming from here. And then it's coming from directly behind us, the viewer, straight directly at these people. And finally, the light is coming from some source we can't identify, because it looks like there's only windows on one wall here, right, on this side where it opens to the outside. And yet there's light hitting, right, the ceiling and this part of the wall. So there's 4 different directions the light is coming from. It's physically impossible. And so those are the most innovative, original, creative, how do you want to say, creative optical illusions of the play of light here, that it's coming from multiple directions, which is physically impossible on planet Earth. So the artist is playing games with us, and it's fascinating. This is at the Prado, by the way, in Madrid. It's well worth taking a few minutes to look at it. Okay, let's do a formal analysis. Now we're going to do one more slide because we don't want to be too far behind. We'll be in good shape. Let's wrap it up with, is it balanced? No, it's unbalanced toward the bottom. The human figures are all below the middle, and there's empty space up here. The rhythm is obvious, all the human figures, arms, hands, legs. Simulated texture, well, Baroque isn't any different than Renaissance, the previous style. Everything is super sharp and realistic, except on the upper part of the princess's body. I have a close-up of this that I took when I was there. Come on, there we go. Look, you see that? That's almost impressionistic on her forehead and her hair and a bit on her dress, on her bodice. They call that the top part of her dress. Those are soft and not super sharp simulated textures. And so what you have is mostly real sharp simulated textures, hair, clothing, the skin, and the room. But on her upper body, it's soft and diffused. Some impressionists claim they were inspired by that technique, which is hundreds of years before Impressionism began. And then we have, let's see, the largest mass. Well, it's probably the room if you count a single mass, or the ceiling, because you can't see all the floor. And then this painting that he's creating right there in front of us of the scene we're looking at. And then you have stable, mostly, yes, the figures mostly human are standing upright. The paintings, the four corners of the room, it's almost all straight lines, but there is a sense of some dynamic detail, mostly on the dresses of the three female. Oh, this is a, well, midget's the old word for this person here. She was probably taken from the streets, maybe even homeless, and brought to live in the palace to be a companion to the princess. And then you see my favorite, or least favorite, I'm sorry, I meant least favorite detail, is this spoiled little brat, her brother, who is, yeah, there's the detail saying of the princess's hair, who's kicking the dog. These are all my photos. What? Come on, parents, train your kid better. Anyway, obviously they're both spoiled, the princess and her brother, the prince. Big surprise, right? Royal families. Anyway, so what you see here is a very, and oh, also for space, you have overlapping, foreshortening, diminishing size, right? And there is a scientific perspective. There's just no atmospheric perspective because it's an interior view. And the colors are alternating cool, warm, cool. Okay, moving on to the last must know for today. I'm going to come back to this. It's been placed. Yeah, it's the way this, but it's an important way to do this. I would have started with this, but it's really important. This slide, very important. You want to take extra careful notes. I'm not cutting the study list. Our last must know for today. We're into around 420, 421 or so. This is calling, as in to be called, calling of Saint Matthew. I think everyone knows that's Matthew. The artist's name, the first great Baroque painter of all time. Most say the greatest Baroque painter of all time. Caravaggio, you probably heard his name if you remember. One of the geniuses who started Baroque style painting. Caravaggio, 1602. So this is considered the first great Baroque painting, comma, by the greatest Baroque painter. Most people wouldn't argue with that, but there are some who do. So just say one, be safe and say one of the most famous Baroque painters. Certainly the first great Baroque painter, and this is considered the first truly Baroque painting. It has all the elements that mark it as Baroque. You've got the unseen presence. Let's get this to another view here, where when you look at it, in the church, I don't know if you saw this in the church, it's on one wall. You actually can barely see Jesus, but you only see his face and part of, or just his hand, the rest of his body. And then Peter next to him, you don't even see Peter's face. You see one hand and bottom of his. So the unseen presence is most of the bodies of Peter and Jesus, who are off to the far right in the corner, in the shadows. So that's the unseen presence. Of course, there you could say there's also the presence of God, but it's more of Jesus as a human asking what? The scene in the Bible in which he asks Matthew to give up his cushy life, his luxurious lifestyle as a tax collector for the Romans. They were all Jewish, all the people in this painting, and they were occupied by the Romans, of course. I think everybody knows that. So he was collecting taxes for the Romans. Now, which one is Matthew? I've heard there's a raging debate. Is it him? But Matthew is supposed to be one of the youngest of all the disciples. That doesn't fit with this guy. Plus, which here's the guy counting the money, who would be the head tax collector, would be the one counting the money at the end of each day. So I think this guy is just pointing at Matthew. Just saying there's a difference of opinions. I think it's the older guy, but many historians, and I would agree with, is say it's a guy at the end of the table who is not even paying attention to Jesus at pointing him out, saying, "Come with me, give up this life, stop collecting money from your fellow citizens, and instead save men. So come and preach with me. Be one of my disciples." So that is because Matthew became the second disciple. We know in the story that he did accept Jesus's invitation, but at first he ignored it. So that to me is what this guy's saying. Are you what? You're telling us that he, our boss, our man, whatever, he's supposed to give this lifestyle? Look how fancy their clothing is. There's your incrustation, ornamentation on the sleeves and the headdress, right, of these, and also the money on the table. And then also on the wall, this is a dive. This is a bar in Rome that actually was the scene where he staged this, the Caravaggio. He hired the actors, or models is the right word, to reenact this scene. And the walls are encrusted with, I can't even tell you what, all kinds of liquids or fluids from the human body. I'll leave it at that. Pretty grotesque. It's meant to be grotesque because he's saying that that's probably the kind of place where Jesus would have gone to recruit people to leave that lifestyle and come with him to preach, in the streets of Jerusalem. So he, that is famous, Caravaggio, the artist, for using dive. He actually hung out in dive bars and found many of his models and even his lovers. Caravaggio was gay, by the way. So some of these people may have been some of his partners, right? But also both models and partners, some of them, not all of them. In any case, it's one of the most famous paintings. And then we have the last thing about the meaning is Caravaggio invented this, the spotlight effect. He invented that technique. Every other Baroque artist imitated it all the way through Rembrandt and even late into the 1700s, where the light's coming from a source off the edge and it highlights the people we're supposed to focus on, which are the people at the table who are all surprised that Jesus would ask their boss to leave his fancy job and go live as a homeless person in the streets. So that's why I see this reaction of him saying, "What? No, you don't think he's going to do what he did," at the end of this story. So what you have is a spotlight effect. It literally is self-explanatory. Of course, he didn't have spotlights. It was done with candles, obviously. But he created that. That's his idea. And so that's why Caravaggio is considered the first great, if not the greatest Baroque painter. Okay.
May I say something?
Yes. And then we're just about at the end of our time. Yes, go ahead.
I don't know if you
Sure.
guys know this or not, but Caravaggio was an excellent sword fighter.
Yes, he was.
And he, could kill people lickety split.
He
Or he
did.
killed the wrong person and
Right.
they hunted and hunted and hunted for him.
Yes.
And then finally they, zeroed in on him and they caught him. But he was a horrible, criminally insane
He had a
person.
violent temper.
Yes.
And he attacked people when they were rivals for the same woman's attention, or other kinds of, in an argument in a bar. Yeah, that's why I say he hung out in dives, and unfortunately he got into fights, and he ended up killing a man. And the Pope issued a warrant for his arrest, and he would have been.
Yes, that's right. The Swiss guards came after him and they
Yeah.
killed him. And when I was little, there was a little girl that was mean, and I said, "You're as crazy as Caravaggio."
Yeah. Well, you guys can add that if you want to part of the meaning. That's excellent description. But the point is that in this painting, we see all the elements that mark something as Baroque for the first time. That's why it's considered first great Baroque painting. And I think I mentioned the intense emotion. Shock. What? You expect that guy to leave? Matthew here, the guy that's collecting the money and making this great salary, he's going to give this life up, this cushy life. So it's surprise or disbelief is the intense emotion. Formal analysis, it's completely unbalanced toward the bottom. All the figures are below the midline. Cement texture, superb on the hair, the clothing, the table, and even the scum, I'll call it scum on the walls and window. Look at it in the windows there. And then you have, of course, the rhythm, right, of the heads, hands, legs, and of course, headdresses or hats on the figures. And assuming the texture, I think I already mentioned on the skin, the hair, and the clothing. Here, the lines are all thin outline. And then we have, the modeling is intense, and that's part of the effect of the spotlight effect, is that is a type of modeling which allows the spotlight effect. And so it's very intense on the faces of the people at the table, and, very dark and chiaroscuro. It's kind of chiaroscuro, but it's a very specific kind invented by Caravaggio. And let's see, well, of course, the walls, green scum color is going to be cool, including the window. And then we have cool white on some of the clothing and warm reds and tans on some other clothing, and all the skin tones are warm. And it is mostly stable. Look, the figures are mostly upright, except for the top half of, we'll say that this is Matthew's body. And then you could say Jesus is pretty much straightforward. His arms out at a right angle, and we can't see the rest of his body, but it's almost certainly straight. Peter, his upper body is tilted, but the windows, the walls, it's more stable than dynamic. And here it's overlapping, foreshortening, diminishing size. Let's see, I think that's it. Yeah, there's no atmospheric perspective, but probably scientific perspective, a vanishing point on the wall behind the building. And the largest mass would be the wall. And then it would be the group. They look like one mass to me, sitting around the table. And then the upper bodies of Jesus and Peter. Okay, we covered a lot, but we're just about where we need to be. I'm going to stop the share. And now, as you know, I stick around if people have questions about anything we just saw. Yes.
Are you showing all of these slides on the test? Are there going to be slides?
No, there's only going to be 8. And I'm going to tell you
8
how
slides?
the test, yeah. 8
I
out
see.
of the study list. We're going to review, and I'll cut the list by a third. And out of those that are left on the study list at the end of the review, expect to have 8 of them to write about. And I'll explain all of that. I'll show you an example of what the test looks like, and you'll get a copy of it sent to you well before the test, so you can print it out or take it online, of course, as a doc, which is how you have to send it to me. Obviously, for an online class, it needs to be sent as a PDF. All of this we're going to go over. It's 3 weeks from now. We're going to go over it in class 2 weeks from tonight, when your papers are due. After we start the lecture, we aren't going to have many more slides. Most of the lecture on the 21st is going to be about how to study for exam. So you want to be here for that. And of course, it'll be posted on YouTube.
And then next week, we're talking about how our papers are going to be written. Is that next week?
Yes. I already did, actually. Yeah, it's on YouTube. I did post that lecture. Yeah, I posted that on Thursday, and I sent you guys an email. But I will recap about how to submit them and answer any questions for sure. It's best next week, unless you're already done with your paper. Then you can forward it to me, or you can ask me by email. But since we run, toward the end or a little over time, next week I'll answer any questions you have about papers, and we will discuss some of the specifics. But I've already covered in great detail. I think it was almost an hour, 45 minutes to an hour last week. The 5 requirements for short papers. Everyone should have that handout. I sent it to everybody. Again, if somehow, for some strange reason, some individuals don't get or can't open the PDFs, it's strange to me. Why would that happen? But it does. Then you just have to email me and I'll resend it to you.
And
it's the 5 requirements, and watch that lecture. It's listed on YouTube as requirements for your research papers. You can watch that, and that'll help. Then if you still have questions, you can ask me next week or by email.
Has anybody ever written a paper PDF and then it shrank it? You had 5 pages, and then you did PDF and it shrank it.
I guess it could happen. I don't
like that.
Yeah, hopefully it won't happen, because it make it harder for me or the readers to grade it accurately. It shouldn't happen that way. Let's just keep our fingers crossed. I mean, once in a while I've had a problem, and all I do is contact the person and ask them to resize or reformat it. And
It happened to me.
send it. Oh, well, I don't know. But there might be something about the specific app. Anyway, you can send it to me. Like I said, anyone can, or even part of it ahead of the deadline, and I can see if it's, easily readable, and I'll confirm that to anyone. Okay. All right. Again, this is my informal office. These are my.
I have a
office.
question.
Sure.
So St. Peter's Basilica by Michelangelo, would that be considered Baroque?
No, No, it's late Renaissance because
Okay,
it's a good question. I could see why you might at first think that, but it doesn't have the bulbous effect to it as much, and it definitely doesn't have an encrustation ornamentation. If you look at it carefully, it's minimal ornament. Anything Baroque is going to be covered in ornaments. Not
Got it.
every single square foot, but most of the facade, like these churches we've been seeing today, and of course the paintings and sculpture. So no, it's not. It's high late. Actually, it's high Renaissance because he designed it in the early 1500s, but it was finished in the late 1500s. Remember that. It's 60 years after he submitted his plan. How many artists get a chance that many years later to come back and finish their dream projects? Michelangelo would be someone that might possibly be rare, the rare case of that happening. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, it's not Baroque. It's Renaissance, and specifically high Renaissance. You could just say Renaissance stuff. Okay, any other questions? Now is a good time because I will, of course, be checking my email when I get home. Well, not when I get home, not at 11 o'clock tonight, tomorrow afternoon, and again, all the way through the weekend if you have questions. But I look forward to seeing you all to finish or almost finish all the Baroque slides. You see, we still have several more. They're pretty important. It may be that we'll finish the last 2 or 3 Baroque paintings, is mostly paintings, on the Monday when we, review for the, not review, but remind you, recap what's required for your papers. Okay, but they are due on the 21st. Don't forget that. It's just on your syllabus. If you don't want to have points off for being late, by midnight, you have an extra period of time in case on the day I have the 21st at the lecture, you get questions answered, or you somehow leave early, or you forgot to ask me something. I will, of course, check my email that evening. But don't wait till the last minute to send it in, because if you send it in, I have to have a cutoff midnight on the 21st. And I'll explain how to send it. Now you'll see, I'll hold up to the screen even, hand printed neatly, written out instructions on how to submit the papers. I don't use Canvas, remember that. So
Why?
you probably all know that by now. Go ahead.
How come you don't use Canvas?
Because it's so cumbersome. I've talked to teachers who've used it, and it broke down 3 times last semester, 3 times in the middle of the semester. I just prefer a more reliable, and you could submit you have 2 choices, or both if you want to really cover your bases. AOL is a more immediate because I check that much more frequently. And yet, of course, the campus website is perfectly acceptable. And that is, of course, through your student portals with the Outlook. And I'll send you the information about all of those, the options and the procedural stuff as well in an email, and answer your questions in person. And like I said, you'll see what I mean. I've done this now for 5 semesters. So it's pretty clear by the end of the day of the week, this lecture prior to the due date, you'll have all the information you need about how to submit the papers. Okay. But I will answer more questions if they come up by email, is the easiest way. All right, I think we've got to 4:30. I think that's a reasonable cutoff. Any absolutely urgent question, because I will check my email again tomorrow afternoon and again over the weekend. And I'll post this video, of course, before 8 p.m. on Friday. All right, you guys. Any other questions? All right, take care. Let's hope we all cool off.
I had one
Okay.
thing. So the midterm, it's not gonna be in the middle of class, right? You're just gonna send us a form or something?
I just said, didn't you hear? I said,
Oh,
about
I'm
an
so
hour
sorry.
ago, I said,
I just want to clarify. It's
a live midterm.
It's
You
a
have
live
to attend
midterm.
that lecture.
Okay.
Yes, you do. And if you can't, then you have to work out an alternative, and it won't be any less work, because that wouldn't be fair to those who took it. And I'm
Okay.
going to cover all that the week before. But to answer part of your question, this is a legitimate question, is you will get the actual test sheets a couple of days, more like 3 or 4 days before the test itself. So you'll have it ready for you, whether you write it out in print, or you do it as a doc. You'll have it in your inbox as a PDF several days before the test, probably on the phone.
All right.
Yeah, sorry, I understand. That's the question you need.
I just want to make extra sure.
Sure, of course.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's what we're
Okay,
here for.
cool. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Wilson.
And you
Sure,
have-
no, you're welcome. So thank you for your input about Rome. That's always fascinating, and giving us the updates on things like, or not updates, the background stories on people like Caravaggio. Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay,
I just want to make sure you have received my accommodations and
yes,
information.
I do. Well, to answer the question in a broader sense, you automatically in the online classes, not in the in-person classes, it would take separate arrangement. We'll have time and a half, because you'll have like, what, 9 hours or not quite 8 hours after the test. The slides are on the screen to, of course, keep writing or change your answers and get them into form to forward to me. You have till midnight. So you've got the time and a half that way. Yeah. But like I said, you can send me any samples for your papers, I'm sorry, in advance, but of course, that's for everybody. If you need some feedback before the papers due. And I will, of course, personally guarantee I'll be grading your paper, because I'm sure it's going to be interesting. And at this point, I usually grade the ones in any class who have any kind of accommodations, pretty much as a given. Okay, how are we doing? Can we move on? And you guys now know that you've got a few things to work on, get your papers ready, and hopefully have them almost at least the first draft done. All right, see you guys next Monday. Take care. Have a good weekend. Bye.